Hey guys, it's 8 Deadly Sin here, coming at you with the video I really wanted to bring to you guys. How TSM can win versus Immortals. That's going to be their first matchup. TSM on the blue side, Immortals on the red side. Immortals probably looking to be one of the most dominant teams, or what people perceive to be one of the most dominant teams right now, especially seeing how they're 2-0. But I'm going to tell you not only how TSM can beat them, but also kind of the flaws that the Immortals lineup has, and how they've been able to cover up those flaws and really shine as one of the most dominant teams coming out of the first week of the NALCS. So let's kind of start in and talk about Immortals, the team. So Immortals, the team, if we talk about the individual members of the Immortals squad, there's not too much that necessarily shines out. I probably would say Huni is the kind of perceived as one of the strongest members in their role than almost any other person on the entire Immortals squad. Just to say that Huni's probably going to be considered the best top laner in NA, and that's not necessarily because Huni is this amazing top laner, just because the top lane competition in NA is pretty bad. Even when he was in EU, the reason he was the top laner in EU is just because there was no one on that same level of Huni. But you can see, especially from Worlds performance, that in Worlds he kind of did get shit on by a lot of the other top laners. And while Fnatic did put up a very good fight at Worlds, you could kind of see how Huni's lack of skill when he compared up to other top laners like Someday and other people along that line. So we can see that Huni is not necessarily the best top laner that ever existed, but probably going to be considered the best top laner in NA for sure. Let's move on to Reignover, their jungle. Now, Huni and Reignover, obviously, former members of Fnatic. Now, Reignover, he does very, very good in the sense that he has nice synergy with Huni already, especially since they're being on the team, and he's just a general pretty consistent jungler. The only problem is I really doubt the depth of his champion pool at this point, because honestly, even last season, you never really saw too much coming up from him, and the reason he was isolated from that flaw is because on the old Fnatic lineup last season, there were just other threats that needed to be banned out, allowing him to always be able to pick up the Rek'Sai, pick up an Elise, and then pick up the other kind of strong meta junglers. And even seeing him go on that Olaf tangent for a while really just kind of showed that he has a very kind of limited jungle pool. Even going into this first week, we only really see him on Rek'Sai and Elise, and the only reason he went on Elise is probably because the Rek'Sai was banned out. And while I don't know he's probably has the ability to play other junglers, you can see that he's definitely most comfortable on this Rek'Sai and Elise. Moving to the mid laner, Polbelter. Polbelter is probably the weakest link for me in this Immortal squad, in the sense that Polbelter himself is probably a mid-tier mid laner, in the sense that he's just going to be middle of the pack by himself. He has, some positional flaws, also some in-lane CSing flaws that can happen. He can get behind if he's properly pressured by the enemy team, but obviously on this Immortals lineup, the jungle pressure is not definitely going to be focused mid, most likely going to be focused top to try to shut down Huni, so Polbelter is given a little more leeway to show his skill. But the only problem for me is that look at the type of champions that he historically plays and that he's been playing so far this split. So he played TF, which is kind of more of that control mage style, and then the Lulu, because it was left open. And while the 7-0 performance on Lulu might seem really good, that's just because Lulu, the champion, is so strong right now. When we kind of saw him on TF, he really, not only tied for the most deaths on the team, but also just having those slight options with his ult and not necessarily having those best ganks come out, while still being able decent to get those picks with the TF gold card. It just kind of seems, and I kind of doubt that pressure as a top lane or a top tier mid laner in the NALCS. I definitely don't think he's number one in terms of skill and mechanical skill, but I think that he fits really nicely in this Immortal squad, which is ultimately what he's trying his goal to accomplish in this, as being an NA resident and also counting for the NA team aspect of what Immortals needs to qualify for an NA team. I think Polbelter is a good mid laner, just a middle tier, middle of the pack mid laner. So I don't think he's necessarily the best, and I think he can be easily exploited. Moving on to Wild Turtle. Wild Turtle, obviously former ADC from TSM. I think Wild Turtle is a very skilled ADC, but even while he can be very skilled and kind of blow up and have these really amazing games, as we saw, he still has the same kind of positional errors that he always did. even on TSM and other things. Now, what I mean by positional errors is like he plays very, very aggressively, and that aggressiveness can be exploited because he's most of the time out of position. If we look to the Immortals Impulse game where he was on Corki, while he never died, no one on the entire team died, he still made those positional errors where if there was a better team, then Team Impulse was probably the worst team in the NALCS right now. If there were better teams that had the proper tools in their champion select to be able to exploit those weaknesses, I think you can easily shut down Turtle and easily catch him out of position. And especially since death timers are so long, all of those missed positions carry a lot more weight just with how long you take to respawn, especially when you get to that mid game, which allows for a lot more objectives to be taken, especially with the amount of damage and fast-pacedness that not only Immortals likes to bring to the table, and what can be possibly brought to the table from other people, other teams if they draft correctly. So Wild Turtle, and if you don't believe me and you think that Wild Turtle is now like changed around and become this really dominant ADC, yes, he played Lucian and Corki, but those are the top ADCs right now in my opinion, so of course he's going to be very, very dominant on this one. They're the best in the meta right now. But even to that, when you saw him with this Corki game, especially with Team Impulse, you would see these very risky Valkyries. There was that one play mid lane, I believe on Gate, where he used the package in such an aggressive manner where if there was an actually, a different mid laner with a different effective kit that would have been more better suited for those early game engagements, especially since Gate was kind of already behind, that he could have easily caught the Wild Turtle out of position. And some of his aggressive Valkyrie plays and stuff are justified because their team are so far ahead, but even if you're ahead, if you have the proper, abilities and kits to be able to exploit someone who is always constantly kind of getting out of the position and maybe being a little too aggressive, that I feel like Wild Turtle can definitely be exploited in that manner, just as he has been in the past. He hasn't really shown too much growth in that area. Well, I will say it's been better than it was before, so I think that's another weakness that TSM can exploit. Going on to Adrian now. Adrian obviously deathless the entire first week, very good. Support. Now, the thing about Adrian, he really likes to go on these kind of zone control passive supports. And what I mean by that is we've seen him on Janna both days right now, a very zone control heavy, very passive support, not very an aggressive support such as a Poppy or a Trundle or anything like that. And I think that I would really interested to see him when he's forced on more aggressive support picks where he needs to be more active in the lane than just kind of passively existing and providing zone control support for his team, which is a lot more effective for Immortals, especially with the playstyle, being able to allow and provide the zone control for all their carries to really shine. So I think Adrian is probably the perfect fit for Immortals, what they're doing, but I think that support style can be easily exploited if they go up against a much more aggressive and much more focused team rather than Team Impulse, which is probably the worst team, and then a C9 without High. So I think if you're up against a much more focused team, that these weaknesses that are kind of chinks in Immortals armors right now can be easily exploited. But let's say why Immortals is doing so good. So if I think that there's so many flaws in the Immortals lineup that can be exploited and such, and also one thing about Huni is Huni can be pretty easily tilted as we saw and in Worlds, but I don't think that's going to be so much the case in NA because there's kind of that lack of competition in the top lane. But I think if there's a proper application of jungle pressure, that you can set Huni behind really fast, as well as kind of try to snowball other lanes just with the pure skill matchup that TSM has. That's why TSM has the advantage in some of these lanes. But let's talk about why Immortals is so good now and why I really like Immortals in terms of their strategy. So what they lack in just pure raw talent and also some of their to cover up their weaknesses is just they have such a good read on the meta right now, which is why they're 2-0. When you look at the teams that they faced and what they drafted as opposed to the style that Immortals is drafting this very skirmish focused mid-game team fight focused teams when I mentioned skirmishing, because look, Huni on Fiora is insane. Fiora provides a lot of massive ability to team fight in the mid game, has the split push threat, and has the ability to transition into the late game a lot better than some of the other people. Elise and Rek'Sai very good at setting up and creating CC chains for mid-game team fighting, as well as just doing a decent amount of damage, especially on Elisa's end for the mid-game. Lulu, very good mid-game fighter, so is TF, so is Lucian, Corki, and Janna just provides that zone control so they can always disengage if something goes wrong, but they're very looking to skirmish and fight early, and then take objectives via victories in those skirmishes and team fights, which is why they get to have these very, very fast games, because not only are all the champions that they have drafted so far in the first week very strong mid-game picks, but but also they don't necessarily need to have an objective taker like a Tristana or like a Jinx or anything like that, because since the changes to the resists on the turret and such, if you win these skirmishes, especially with the increase in death timers in combination with the lack of armor on turrets, now you're able to snowball those objectives way quicker than you would before the preseason patch in 6.1, which is why you're having these very low game times. And if you've watched any of my videos before, you know I always say that teams, if they're doing and reading the meta correctly and drafting correctly, should be able to end every single game before 30 minutes. There are some special cases where you can negate that from the other team if you have another perfect draft, but it seldom very much happens. So I believe since Immortals just is showing that they have such a dominant understanding, whoever is doing their analysis and pick and ban phase just has such a dominant understanding of how the meta works and what you should be picking into these scenarios. And since the rest of the teams pretty much have an inherent lack of that, besides maybe Energy, who's also being very dominant right now, the rest of the teams just kind of display a certain lack of knowledge of how the meta should be played on 6.1, which really makes Immortals the kind of top dog team right now until these other top teams like TSM kind of pick up the meta, and that's where I'm going to pick up. I'm going to say how TSM can win this game purely from a pick ban phase. So let's talk about TSM now, the opposers. So TSM here has fairly first day pick and bans versus Counter Logic Gaming. I already made a video on this. It's pretty garbage when you're trying to think about the meta. So let's talk about TSM's strengths right now. I think that the weakest member on TSM right now is kind of between Haunter. I think it would be Haunter would just be the weakest member, not because he's terrible at top lane, not because he's a bad player. I think Haunter's a very good player, way better than me. I think just because, like, Double Lift is such a strong mechanically gifted player, as well as just being very dominant in the NA scene before. Bjergsen, the name speaks for itself, probably the best mid laner in the West right now, probably for sure in NA, if not in EU as well. Yellow Star, dominant, and shot calling support from Fnatic, as we've seen the Fnatic super team from EU that won, undefeated, as well as bringing a lot of that experience that's needed to kind of rein in these very dominant personalities of this team, as well as taking off the shot calling burden of Bjergsen. We got Svenskeren, who is fairly decent in the jungle, also has some synergy with Bjergsen being knowing him as well, and providing and being a very aggressive style jungler, allowing them to put a lot more pressure in these lanes than say past junglers that TSM has had. So Haunter and Svenskeren are kind of tied for the weakest members on TSM right now. I would kind of just say Haunter in general, but I think Haunter's still very strong and very capable of beating Huni in this lane, especially if he drafts correctly. Now, as I said, day one drafting versus Counter Logic Gaming on the left was a very shit draft, and you can watch that video on that analysis. I'm not going to go too much into this, and they kind of start getting better coming into day two against Team Liquid, but even there, the draft had certain weaknesses and didn't really react to the type of game style that Team Liquid was doing, which is why this game went 43 minutes and why this Counter Logic game also went past 40 minutes, just because not only are the drafts kind of half-assed by both teams, I think TSM really lacks fundamental things that they could have easily picked up in these drafting phases that were left unbanned, left unpicked when they were picking certain picks that could have been, better suited, as I've gone over in both videos. I've analyzed both teams, both days in both games, so if you want to watch those videos and see more specifically how they could have improved their drafts there. So I've identified that Team Solar Mid definitely has the mechanical skill and has a decent enough macro understanding of the game that I'm not going to sit here and say how TSM can change their macro level play to improve on this, but I feel like the most eminent part of why TSM is either close to losing these games or barely winning these games is just because of an ineffective and improperly used picking and banning phase, which is why I'm going to get into how TSM can win this game. Now that we've seen the stats and kind of discussed the teams before we're going in, let's jump right into what they should be doing this game. So let's start with suggested bans. Now when I mean suggested bans, these are the bans that TSM should be doing almost in the order that I'm predicting that they should be doing in this game if they want to get off on a good start. Obviously TSM is blue side, meaning that they get that first pick advantage, meaning that they can leave more things open, but also leave strong picks unbanned, almost forcing Immortals to ban those top tier picks such as Lulu, Gangplank, and such in the fear of a first pick, while allowing them to get a little more targeted with their bans and such. So let's go into the first ban I think they should do. I think they should do a Fiora ban. Fiora is probably the strongest top laner right now in terms of damage, team fight ability, and split push potential. She just does an insane amount of true damage with her passive, the ability to kite around and dance around targets and get a lot of true damage and damage on them with her passive, and her Q being able to dance around them like that, as well as the riposte parry to be able to also cause people to stun when any CCs got up her, along with her ult, provides a lot of team fight utility, especially in the mid game, and also does a massive amount of damage when coupled with that pure damage that the ult allows her to put on by getting all those critical points hit, meaning that she's very good in team fighting in the mid game, which is where Immortals likes to take their team fights. And we've already seen Huni do extremely well on this champion. I haven't really seen Haunter play it too much, so unless Haunter somehow has become a really, really good Fiora player and they want to risk first picking it, which I wouldn't suggest in this scenario, I would say just take the Fiora off the board. The next ban I would suggest is Ryze. I think this is a safer ban in the sense that I don't think Immortals has the team mentality that they would want to pick the Ryze. The reason I'm banning out the Ryze here is because since my strategy for the picks and bans is really going to mirror a very aggressive early to mid game strategy to be able to counter the playstyle of Immortals, I think that they might suggest or might think that the Ryze might provide them that late game option to carry, and I think that both Huni and Polebelter would be effective enough to be able to take this in either of their lanes. So I think just getting rid of the Ryze as this really late game carry threat for TSM is going to be the best thing to do. The reason I have an asterisk by this name is because Ryze, out of all three bans that I have on the screen right now, is probably the most flexible, in the sense that there's two other champions that I also would suggest banning second in their second ban phase. This first would be Corki. Corki is probably the strongest ADC right now just in terms of utility and damage he can bring, especially in team fighting in the mid game. The package is insane, along with that movement speed buff he gains. Every time you pick up the package, you're pretty much guaranteed a kill if you're playing Corki right. So I think that Corki would be a safe ban, especially taking that away from Wild Turtle, but definitely not my first choice for the second ban, just because I think that also makes Immortals pick up the Lucian or have a higher priority on the Lucian, which I think would be better if it was able to kind of go through and be able to pick that up for TSM. So I think another ban that could possibly replace this Ryze would be Lissandra, just kind of really banning out the really heavy mid-game team fighting top laners from Immortals, kind of being able to put a stopgap into that very aggressive mid-game skirmish-focused team fighting style that they're bringing, allowing them to end these games so soon. So that's another option that could be banned out. But then again, I think Fiora is a lot better than Lissandra. So I think if you ban out the Fiora, you really don't have to fear the Lissandra if you're playing the matchup correctly, especially what I'm going to suggest Haunter to be taken in the top lane. It isn't that much of a threat, so I would definitely suggest the Ryze over the other two options. Now the third ban is a bit kind of getting into what I think you can exploit potential weaknesses of Immortals, and I've already kind of talked over. I think Rainover is a very excellent jungler, but definitely not a shining player, definitely not a carry player in the sense that you really only see him kind of play these either Elise, Rek'Sai, and even in the past season you really only seen him pick up the Olaf and maybe a Gragas game here or there. But Rek'Sai is pretty much one of his favorite fallback comfortable champions. And then he's also displayed immense skill on Elise. So I think ban out the Rek'Sai, copy what Team Impulse did. I think Team Impulse had a very good idea of banning out that Rek'Sai. I just didn't think they operated the second half of that strategy right, which would have been taking away the Elise pick. And we'll get into that in suggested picks and ultimately the ideal team comp that TSM should have to beat Immortals. So I think the Rek'Sai ban is crucial in the fact that it takes Rainover off one of his most comfortable jungle champions that also has a lot of mid-game utility, the ability to put a lot of pressure on these lanes, and also has great ganks, especially with the tunnels and the lack of vision that is coming in the preseason, allowing Rek'Sai to have a lot more gank paths than what would have normally been normally possible for a Rek'Sai. So I think Rek'Sai is the perfect ban to kind of get Rainover out of his comfort zone, but this ban is only contingent on picking the Elise, which is what I'm going to get into when we talk about suggested picks. So let's go at what I think Immortal is going to be banning. And now this just comes from the fact that they're on red side. So when you're on red side, there's pretty much a few guaranteed bans that you have to do. And Immortals has had one red side game, and this would be the same bans that they did in that one. I see that they're going to predict this because they seem, especially with the bans that they had on their blue side game, a lot more flexible, a lot more targeted with their bans. But when we get to their red side bans, they pretty much mirror what is happening in every single region. LCK, EU, and NA, and LPL, all these picks on the red side are pretty much 100% guaranteed bans almost, and if they're not, they're usually picked up right away too. So let's get into my first predicted ban for Immortals. It's going to be that Tahm Kench, probably one of my top champions for Haunter to be playing, because I just think Tahm Kench provides so much utility and almost doesn't lose any matchup in the top lane just because he has to sit there, farm, and become tanky. But that's probably why Immortal banned it out when they were on red side versus, I believe it was C9 when they banned that out, and probably why they probably are going to ban it against TSM, because it's just such a strong top lane pick, and Haunter displayed a decent amount of skill, his only deaths being very micro flaws in the sense that is micro, and he forgets to use his gray health when it was that time where he would have lived if he would have used it, and just kind of very mechanical micro game flaws instead of actual like necessary positioning or anything. So I think that Haunter's very strong in this champion, which is why they're going to ban it out, but also Tahm Kench is very strong in general, so that's why I predict that Immortals is going to ban that out anyways. Now, the second ban that I think Immortals is going to do is this Lulu, and the reason that they're going to ban out the Lulu, even though Pole Belter had such a good game on it, is the fact that they're on red side. They don't want to risk giving up the Lulu. Pretty much insta-pick if it's open, and I would suggest TSM, even though a Lulu isn't in my predicted bans or anything, if they do not ban Lulu on the red side, pretty much guaranteed pick it up. That would have to change a couple bans and such that you would have that I've suggested already, but that's almost like a free give me, especially for this mid-game skirmish fight comp that I want to put together for TSM, as well as to be able to combat the style that Immortals is bringing with this very fast-paced gameplay that 6.1 allows you to have and be very dominant on. So not only is Lulu just great in those types of team comps, which is why she's being banned out now, she's very strong, doesn't experience the late game slump, provides a lot of utility with her ult and the speed and shielding that she gives, but also does a crap ton of damage, especially with Thunderlords in that early to mid game, and never really experiences the fallback of that post 40 minutes Lulu. Now, the third and final ban that I think Immortals is going to be, remember this is all predicted opinion, but it's pretty much guaranteed to be the Gangplank. Regardless if Gangplank is not the third ban in the row, Gangplank for sure is going to be a ban by Immortals on the red side. Gangplank has pretty much been 100% red side ban, and whenever he hasn't, he's almost always been picked immediately because he's just that strong. Just a massive amount of attack damage, AoE, armor pen, and armor shredding with those barrels, as well as the ability to manipulate and control zones in team fights by being able to fall back on a barrel system that's already been set up, and then using those barrels to set up massive amount of not only wave clear to siege and counter siege more even better, but also the ability to kind of initiate and poke out large chunks of pretty much armor shredding damage that almost becomes pure damage, coupled with the right items when you kind of get to that mid-game spike, especially with Trinity Force, IE, and other items such as that, but also the global presence of his ult, allowing him to initiate dives and mitigate the effects of dives with having that global presence just makes him such a huge damage threat that almost necessitates a ban every single time. Again, one of those champions where if it's not banned, I suggest TSM pick it up right away regardless of what I'm saying in the future of this video, but I pretty much think it's a guaranteed ban coming from Immortals' side. So let's get into TSM's suggested picks per role. Now I'm going to list 3 picks per role that I think that each member of TSM should aim to play in this game to be able to set up an effective team comp to be able to counter Immortals, and I'll get into that on the next slide where I talk about what the ideal team comp and how they should execute it for TSM to be able to win this game. But also I'm going to mention an honorable mention that would be just as good but probably not the best for their role depending on how the actual picks and bans shape out, and a dishonorable mention that I do not want to see any of these members playing on specifically, regardless if they've played it in the past or have yet to play it. So let's start with top lane and Haunter. Now, I think the number one pick that he should try to pick up, especially if he wants to play this tanky style. We've seen him on the Mundo, which I'll talk about when we get to the dishonorable mention, and we've seen him on the Tahm Kench. So if he's going to play that role of being more of a frontliner and not willing to pick up the Fiora, I think that Zac is probably the best bet. Now, you're thinking, why Zac? Zac's more of a jungle role, but again, I'll remind you, Freddy took it up in the top lane in the EU LCS and provides just as much utility as a jungle Zac, but comes here. So the reason I say this is because if TSM has any inkling of taking a Mundo, I instantly am going to counter and say you have to take the Zac. Zac is just infinitely better than Mundo, especially for mid-game, and especially for kind of countering the aggressiveness and the mid-game power that Immortals is going to definitely for sure bring with their lineup. And why do I say that? Because Mundo provides no teamfight utility. He just sits there and does nothing, especially when you have such a good top lane and jungle synergy coming out of Immortals. That Mundo is going to be shut down harder than anything. We already saw this this in the Immortals TIP game where Feng's Mungo was completely destroyed coming out and pretty much was ineffectual in the mid game, meaning that, you know, they already understand how to handle the Mundo, so that's why you wouldn't pick it there in that situation. But Zac provides so much team fight utility. Not only is he just as tanky as Mundo, provides that frontline presence that Mundo would have. His passive gives him a little bit more utility in making people, you know, having that annoyance factor and being able to have to take him out with the globlets, or he's being to be able to get up. But the utility in CC coming out from bounce around in his ult is able to, you know, provide and set up a lot of damage in these team fights and be able to negate the presence of Immortals. Since Immortals likes to kind of pick these more less tanky, less frontline based, more damage heavy comps, if Zac gets a good bounce around and kind of negates and fragments that damage coming out from Immortals for a second, being able to set up a lot of damage coming from Bjergsen, coming from Double Lift, coming even from Svenskeren, if he's able to kind of get that CC on there for a moment and they'll be able to go all in, they're going to be able to eliminate a lot of these members before they deal that damage that is going to give them an advantage that we've historically seen in these Immortals games for the past from the past week. So that's why I like Zac. Also, the slingshot radius provides just a massive amount of pressure around the map at all times. Whenever you don't see the Zac, he's able to engage over long distances and walls because that range is insane. The amount of pressure that a Zac puts on the enemy team, especially for sieging turrets and sieging specifically Nexus turrets, being able to jump over that wall and engage from such a long distance is just insane. So not only is it great zone control and pressure, but also kind of great zone control, pressure, and damage in CC coming out from the Zac. That's really, really good. I think way better than a Mundo pick. The second pick that I would suggest for Hunter would be a Lissandra. I kind of already talked about this in the bans, but Lissandra is just one of the top tier mid-game team fighting top laners right now. She's even better at team fighting than Fiora just because of her kit, but doesn't have as good late game scaling. She has a bit of a scaling factor because the Roa buffs are really nice and do a lot for her, but also Lissandra just brings a bunch of magic damage, AoE area of effect damage right there, AoE, and that's just insane in the team fighting in her kit. And when you get to the actual CC that she provides, not only is she able to get right into the middle of these fights with her Q and be able to apply that CC across a large amount of members when they're doing in these skirmishes, the point and click nature of her ult not only allows you to get nice pick off the squishy members of Immortals, and if we looked how Immortals is playing 6.1, they're playing these very high damage but very squishy comps, so that kind of point click CC is going to be immense in being able to blow up those carry targets of Immortals and trying to not only fragment those team fights but also kind of blow up that member and set them already to a 4v5 advantage, or depending on how many they're skirmishing with, having an instant advantage, as well as the saving factor of her ult acting as a second Zhonya's, and as well as healing her, allowing her to have better utility in the team fight, especially in these bottleneck areas where that large area of effect would be very useful. The last pick for Haunter in the top lane would be the Tahm Kench. I already explained why Tahm Kench is so good when I was talking about why Immortals is probably going to ban him, but if he's not banned, I think Tahm Kench for sure should be picked up by Haunter. He displayed an immense amount of skill. I think it's able to counter pretty much any top lane matchup because all he has to do there is sit there and farm. I think if they decide to decide to lane swap, which I wouldn't suggest with how I'm suggesting TSM play in this matchup, even if they do and decide to go against what I'm suggesting in sense of a lane swap, Tahm Kench would still be very strong, but there should never be a scenario where they need the lane swap with the team comp I'm going to suggest. Honorable mention, I'm saying Olaf. Olaf not only provides a nice tankiness factor, he just has the pure ham factor in the sense that he's able to run down low mobility carries with his ultimate up and just deal a massive amount of damage and get those kills. We kind of saw this with Gamsu and Fnatic. Well, Gamsu's probably not the best example in terms of consistency on the Olaf. The Olaf kit is very effective in being able to eliminate low mobility champions. So I think if the Lucian does manage to go over to Immortals before TSM can pick it up, I think the Olaf would be a good thing to be able to run that down. Even though he has the E dash away, he's just going to be able to chase him down through Ragnarok and do a massive amount of damage and really try to not only split up and fragment the Immortals lineup, but also being able to kind of take advantage of any positional errors coming out of Wild Turtle, specifically if he's on a low mobility 80 carry. Dishonorable mention, Mundo. Mundo's absolute garbage. You can watch any of my videos where there's been a Mundo in the game. It just serves no purpose, especially in this 6.1, which focuses so heavily on the mid game, because it can easily be shut down by Fiora solo or through multiple other avenues with jungle top synergy and ganks. And once he's been shut down, he's not effective until past the 40-minute mark, where you have already lost the game at this point if you're playing against Immortals and how they construct their are really strong meta team comps in the sense of that really mid-game skirmishing style. So I think Mundo would just be a terrible choice for top lane. Going into the jungle, I'm thinking Elise is my #1 pick for Svenskeren. While he kind of failed on Elise in that previous game that he played on it in week 1, I don't think that was so much of his skill on Elise more than the matchup that he was playing and how those team fights ultimately worked out when they were in that kind of multiple people skirmish phase of the game, especially when they got into 5v5s, 4v5s, and such like that. I think Elise just provides a lot of gank ability. Her gank pathing is insane with the repel and the range of the cocoon combined with the lack of wards, allowing her to get into these lanes a lot more efficiently and sneakily and have a lot more gank paths open to her, and the range of the cocoon is good enough that it can be used as a tool to get picks as well as a tool to secure kills in lane and get these laners ahead. But the nice thing about Elise is she does a massive amount of early game damage. When I mean early game, I'm even talking about levels 1 through 4, especially coupled with Thunderlords, being able to half health somebody with a full spell combo if done correctly, and just does that massive amount of damage and very effective with the ganking. And coupled with that, it also becomes a very good mid-game threat and can be somewhat serve as a pseudo frontline, especially if she picks up the Rylai's as a not only a magic damage item but also providing a little health stats to her as well. I think that's very good. Second reason, Zac. Every reason I said Zac is good in the top lane just means he's even better in the jungle, especially with his jungle pathing with the length of the slingshot. So if it's not picked up for top lane for Haunter, I would very much suggest it for Svenskeren just because of the great utility and gank ability that it applies, and the ability to get Bjergsen ahead and the ability to get Haunter ahead and double lift ahead depending where they want to target their ganks and depending who's on which champion. So I think that he has the ability to get Bjergsen and double lift ahead if he takes the Zac with just the amount of gank pressure that the Zac will have, as well as the frontline factor that it also provides, depending either if it's in top or jungle. The next mention that I'll mention is Graves. I think Graves just does a massive amount of damage in the jungle right now, way better than Kindred, and I'll get into that. Just does a massive amount of armor shredding damage, especially in this mid-game team fighting phase, so there's going to be a lot of burst damage coming out, especially if Svenskeren plays off the structures and the walls correctly with the Graves Q. And even if he doesn't, even the delay is a couple seconds. It's not going to be too bad. It just does a massive amount of damage. Probably one of the best ADC junglers that you have right now, and especially if you can get Haunter on a Tahm Kench or a Zac in the top lane, it really opens you up for more damage dealers and carry potential in the jungle coming from Svenskeren. Honorable mention is going to be Lee Sin. He's honestly the AD version of Elise. I think Elise does a lot more damage, has a lot more gank paths and longer gank paths that can be open with just the sheer range of the abilities that he has, but Lee Sin also wouldn't be bad in the fact that he also does a lot of early game damage, a very aggressive early game jungler, allowing him to get his lanes ahead. Not in the same way Elise would do, but just as effectively if Elise is taken off the table from like a counter ban or a suggested ban coming out from Immortals in reaction to the Rek'Sai ban that I suggested. Now, dishonorable mention is going to be Kindred. I think Kindred is absolute garbage right now in the patch. Not the fact that she doesn't do enough damage, the fact that Kindred is just too squishy, in the sense that if any CC lands on Kindred, they're instantly going to be chunked out, especially with the combination of Thunderlords and various abilities coming from more than one champion. I think that Kindred instantly gets chunked out and eliminated before the ult can even come down, and if the ult comes down in that scenario, it's just to save the Kindred, which pretty much almost sets your team up for death every time the Kindred ult is used that I've historically seen. I've really never seen any team be able to fully execute an enemy team within the Kindred ult. I almost see all of them used defensively and most likely ineffectually defensively, where they just die trying to run away even when they're outside the Kindred ult and not invulnerable. So I think it's obviously a trash jungler, still does a lot of damage, might even get banned in this game if they don't follow what I suggest and what I've predicted will happen, but honestly I think it's pretty garbo compared to a Graves that just does a lot more damage. Moving to the mid lane in Bjergsen, honestly probably one of the biggest threats on TSM, which is why he's going to be getting one of the champions that does the most damage. My three suggestions are Syndra, LeBlanc, and Victor. Now let's talk about Syndra and LeBlanc at the right now, just because of how much damage they do, and that's our only job, is to be pure AP bursters, and the fact that Syndra I would rank a little bit more highly than the LeBlanc, just because I think Syndra has a bit more utility and a bit more appeal factor, especially when coupled with Spooky Ghost, allows her to really secure and set up a full spell rotation, which does a lot of damage, just as LeBlanc's full spell rotation would do. LeBlanc has a bit more mobility, but I think that not only Bjergsen's personal experience on Syndra makes it a better pick for him, but also the amount of damage and utility it can bring with Spooky Ghost in combination with the multiple people stun that it can get, and the huge single target damage that the the ult can pull off, especially if a lot of Qs are set up in advance. So I think both of those champions in the same vein are very good because they're going to provide a lot of the AP, huge amount of burst damage that's going to be coming in the mid game that is going to be crucial to winning these fights. I think Syndra would be a bit better just because she provides a bit more zone control than the LeBlanc, and getting in the zone control is the Victor. I think Victor is very good, especially for the mid game. While he does take a while to kind of scale up, it's actually really fast with the high amount of volume that he can farm with his E and the laser like that. And he also has a little bit more tankiness because of the not only movement speed buff from the empowered Q, but also that shield that it inherently gets him, and his ability makes him very much tanky, a little more sustainability in the mid lane, and at worst, all he does is just farm with his E constantly, meaning he's pretty much guaranteed to scale up and do a lot of damage. He does not only huge amounts of wave clear, which is crucial for sieging and fast pushing, as well as counter sieging if they ever get into that position, but not only does he scale very well into the late game, if it gets to the point where this game goes more than 35 minutes and heads into that 40-minute range, which it very might well do, but also just provides a lot of zone control with the gravity well in the area of effective abilities and that burst damage to potentially chunk out or kill many members on Immortals right away. Honorable mention going to be Corki. Corki, as I said, is one of the strongest ADCs right now, but also one of the strongest mid laners. We saw Faker's performance on Corki, as well as some other Korean teams pick up the Corki mid lane. It just does an insane amount of damage as an AD carry threat, especially into that mid game when he experiences the power spike with Trinity Force in combination with a bunch of other ADC items, which can be ranged from IE, Bloodthirster, and such. So it just does a massive amount of damage and massive amount of burst damage. Also has that poke factor and the engage factor of the package, pretty much guaranteeing, especially a very mechanically skilled player like Bjergsen, to kill every time. Dishonorable mention, Twisted Fate. The reason I'm putting Twisted Fate on here is while Twisted Fate might be very strong, the reason he's dishonorable is the sense that I haven't seen a lot of NA teams very execute effectively on the pick comp that you would have to build around a TF. A TF solo into this kind of skirmishy team fighting comp really doesn't fit because he's never going to be able to safely ult in and gold card any priority targets without instantly getting jumped on and destroyed. And we kind of saw that with Gate in the Immortals game like that. While that might not be the perfect example, but there's no real reason to pick a Twisted Fate into the type of team comp that Immortals is crafting, because as soon as TF tries to ult anywhere near Immortals team, they can instantly disengage who they're fighting on, focus the TF as soon as he drops in, and insta-kill him almost before he even does enough damage to get anybody out. So that's why I think Twisted Fate should be pulled off, just in the context of what Immortals like to draft and how they like to play the game. Now for ADC for Double Lift, the top three choices are going to be Lucian, Corki, and Kalista. Now I already talked enough about Corki, so I'm not going to mention any more about him, but Lucian is my top pick for Double Lift, just because of the sheer amount of damage and in-lane presence that Lucian has. While Corki might be my top ADC of the season so far, I think Lucian is the strongest in-lane just because of the in-lane dominance he can display, as well as coupled with his piercing light poke that can happen and the damage that he can put out, especially with Fervor comboed with the twin shot of his passive when that happens to get procs off ability, allowing him to stack massive amounts of damage on people and get a lot of kills and be very dominant in-lane, pretty much winning any matchup against any other ADC that can be mentioned right now in the season as being strong. Lucian pretty much dominates in lane, and the wave clear of the culling and the damage coming out from the culling in that single direction really helps in this kind of zone control team that I want to craft for TSM on how they can win, as well as just doing a massive amount of damage in the mid game, allowing to scale very well. We saw this with Piglet in that Team Liquid game that TSM was in. Piglet was just being an insane beast on this Lucian in the mid game, which is one of the reasons why Team Liquid almost won that game. Where there are other flaws in that lineup, you can watch my video I made on that to see the flaws in how Team Liquid lost that game, even though they had such mid-game control. So to really provide that mid-game control that TSM desperately needs to counter the style of Immortals is through the Lucian. Kalista on the same vein. Kalista, very good team fight ADC. The reason I say this is a lot of utility with the Fate's Call and being able to knock up large members of Immortals team, as well as just the pure amount of area of effect attack damage that Kalista does, as well as the ability to kite away and kind of maneuver and position in these team fights that Double Lift would be very good at. I think that would just does a massive amount of damage, provides a nice threat. Another thing that I wouldn't be disappointed if TSM chose. Now, honorable mention would be Ezreal. The reason it's an honorable mention and not a thing is not even a dishonorable mention is while the arcane shifts coming out from Double Lift were a little iffy in that Team Liquid game, you can't doubt that Ezreal does an insane amount of damage near the end of the mid game once he stacks that Muramana and gets that full tier item going, and that damage and poke damage comes out insane, as well as the kite ability of the blue Israel and the ability to set up chase with the blue Israel slows. I think is just insane. Does a lot of damage. That's why it's an honorable mention, but I don't think it provides enough team fight utility in mid-game damage and early game damage that the other ADCs that I listed do, so that's why it's just an honorable mention. Dishonorable mention, Tristana. While he got a lot of kills on his Tristana when he played it, I think Tristana is pretty garbage in the meta right now because there's no reason to pick her. She becomes a late game threat, yes, but at that point the game shouldn't be going that long, especially with how Immortals likes to play the game, and especially with how TSM needs to play the game to win against Immortals. I think Tristana is very bad in the sense the only thing she brings to the mid and early game is her ability to push objectives and turrets, but since turret armor has been reduced in 6.1 and the preseason patch, meaning it's easier to take objectives and snowball objectives in a lane because there is no more of that armor that was previously experienced, making Tristana so strong at taking those turrets last season. So there's really no reason to use her because you can just fast push turrets with the longer death times and lower armor values on the inner turrets, even up to inhibitor turrets, meaning that there's no reason to take Tristana unless you're going to be pushing up to inhibitor turrets every time you push a lane with her, and if you can't do that, it's not worth to pick her up. Also, one of the reasons why I didn't like that in that first game that TSM played against CLG, you can watch that video to kind of get more in depth in that Tristana pick. Let's move on to support. For Yellowstar, I think the number one support that Yellowstar should be picking up is Trundle. I think it just provides so much zone control with the pillars, as well as the utility of being able to sap away the armor of the tanky members of Immortals. And since Immortals doesn't really like to make or draft very, very tanky people, unless it's like the counter pick situation with the Cho'Gath, but likes to draft these very kind of squishy, high damage mid-tier, mid-game skirmish comps, I think the Trundle being able to take away the armor of anyone that is even considered their pseudo frontline is going to give TSM a huge advantage, especially with the damage that I've drafted or suggested in these top 3 picks for each position. I think coupled with that is going to be able to take out any of those members and provide a big team fight advantage and zone control advantage to TSM, coupled with the Ice Pillar and the ability of his ult to steal those stats. Alistar next. I think Alistar provides a lot of engage, which is very crucial. One of the strongest supports right now in the meta. Also provides a lot of frontline presence with his ult, and coupled with his tankiness that he gets as he progresses into the mid and late game. And the in-lane synergy, especially with my top pick of Lucian for both Trundle and Alistar, is very good. Very lane-dominant picks. It would coupled with any of the ADCs I've suggested for Doublelift right now, especially if Kalista is chosen. I would even put more priority on the Alistar just because of that cow delivery system that is able to set up a lot of that CC and the headbutts. But I think Headbutt Pulverize is a very good engage tool, especially Flash Headbutt Pulverize. I think Yellowstar has historically been proven on the Trundle. I've been using that in Fnatic since last season. Alistar obviously is going to be very familiar with. And the last suggestion would be Poppy. The reason I'm suggesting Poppy is not only does it provide another pseudo frontliner like all these supports do, but Poppy has a really good tool with her W to be able to stop not only engages and dashes towards her and towards her team, but also out and away from her team with that movement speed buff, allowing them to really get on to certain targets if Immortals is trying to disengage a skirmish that didn't go too well for them, and being able to set up those kills, as well as the disengage tool of her ultimate. But her ultimate can also be a great engage tool if it's used at point blank range, because it just knocks them up right above Poppy and allows them to come right back down, able to set up the massive damage and zone control damage that I'm suggesting for TSM in this team comp. So I think Poppy fits very, very well into that. Also a very aggressive laner, being able to get the CC with her E off in the lane, coupled with Lucian, Corki, or Kalista would be just as effective. Honorable mention, I gave 2. It's going to be either Janna or Braum, just based on their ability to zone control and control team fights. We saw Janna with Adrian also would be a good takeaway from him. Braum would also be good, especially coupled with the Lucian, to be able to set up that in-lane pressure even more with the ability to get the stun passive off, and the zone control that his ult gives is insane, as well as that slow not only to engage but also disengage, and the blocking of the poke damage that would be coming out from certainly the ADC and other members and ranged members of Immortals, especially if a Lulu or something gets through. Braum's able to block a lot of that damage. Very good. Dishonorable mention, I'm just going to say Bard. Only reason I'm saying Bard is not because of the performance of Bard that Yellowstar had. I think his performance was meh at best. It wasn't necessarily bad. It wasn't necessarily good. The reason I don't like Bard is while he does a lot of damage and he can have a mid-game presence, he's just too squishy all of the game, regardless if it's early, mid, or late, meaning that he can easily be picked off, and if he doesn't land the ults perfectly, then he's pretty much useless and just becomes a cosmic binding bot. So if you can't land those ults, pretty much useless, and why take the risk of having to rely on landing the ults when you have way better control, zone control, engage supports that I've already suggested that are a lot more tanky than Bard, not only providing more of a front line to TSM, giving them an advantage in these team fights, but a lot more team fight utility in the sense of their zone control as well as the engage tools that all three options also uniquely mention. So I think there's no reason for a Bard to be picked in this game for TSM. Now, getting on to TSM's ideal team comp, and what I really think that if they drafted this perfectly and if all my suggestions go perfectly through, that they can easily beat Immortals with, and I'm going to discuss why after I get through it. So, first pick, remember the bans, Rek'Sai, Fiora, Ryze, Rek'Sai. So if you're banning Rek'Sai, first pick Elise. Take that away from Reignover, meaning you've stripped him of his two most comfortable champions and two champions that he's shown a lot of aptitude on, meaning not only are you giving yourself an advantage in the jungle, but it's going to force him onto something like a Graves, it's going to force him onto something like a Kindred, it's going to force him onto an even more obscure jungler, giving you a lot of advantage in the jungle, but also just all the reasons Elise is so good is why she would be really good in this team comp, because it fits with any mid-game skirmish or zone control team comp that you're going to craft, meaning not only does it take away an integral tool to Immortals and how they like to play the game, but it also gives TSM an advantage to be able to win the mid game and end this game very, very fast. Now, the second pick phase is for TSM, which would be the third pick phase in the entire game, would be the Trundle and Lucian combo of the bot lane. I think you need to put a lot of priority on the Lucian pick because it's just so strong, and Wild Turtle may have already drafted it away at this point, so you can fall back on any of the other suggestions that I've suggested in the previous slide. But I think that Lucian is the strongest in the sense that you need to put enough priority on it, but it doesn't have priority over the Elise, because that will definitely be picked up by Immortals if it's left open, especially within the context of a Rek'Sai ban, which is what we saw in the Impulse game when they didn't first pick the Elise when they banned the Rek'Sai. So I think it definitely requires and necessitates them taking their next drafting phase to be able to draft the Lucian and the Trundle. I think the Trundle fits a lot better just because of the amount of zone control that it can provide, as well as the ability to set up a lot of the in-lane poke and damage of Lucian with the slow of the Pillar of Ice, as well as the utility of taking away the stats, making it easier for Lucian and Elise to get kills on even some of the pseudo tanks that Immortals is most likely going to draft. So I think very good. Now, the final and third picking phase of TSM, which I mislabeled too, sorry about that, but you get the deal. The last picking phase for the last two picks should be Zac for sure in the top lane for Haunter. I think I've already discussed why it's a very good pick, so you can go earlier in the video to hear that, just the amount of utility that it provides with the range of the slingshot and the utility of the bounce around, as well as the tankiness that it brings, is about the same as a Mundo and even stronger in the mid game than Mundo with that utility and pressure. But my other pick is kind of split between Victor and Syndra. I think this would be more of a preference on the Bjergsen and what he wants to play in the context of the Immortals lineup, but I think both Victor and Syndra are my top picks for the mid lane pick, not only because, A, they provide a lot of wave clear, which is necessary to set up sieges and to be able to fast push lanes when people are dead with the elongated death timers, but also the amount of damage that they do. Victor does an insane amount of burst damage and poke damage with his laser, as well as the ability of his on-hit effect of his Q and his ult, but also provides a lot of zone control with his laser and his gravity well, which is very necessary. But Syndra also provides a lot of zone control with the cone of her stun, her E, and the ability to stun multiple people with that, as well as just sheer damage of her ult and burst damage of her ult. So if coupled with the now nerfed but still very, very strong Spooky Ghost, allowing her to set up full spell rotations, it's very, very good. I think either mid laner would be just as good, which is why I put two options down for TSM to choose in my ideal team comp to beat Immortals. And now I'm going to discuss why this team comp would beat Immortals. And the reason it's going to beat Immortals, if we look back to all their team comps, they make team fight skirmishing comps. That is exactly what Immortals does. And when I mean team fight skirmishing comps, they're very strong in the mid game, which is why they have such short game lengths compared to the rest of the NALCS. That's why they're doing these games so fast, is because they're so heavily focused on the early and mid game team fighting, and they use those one team fights and picks to be able to snowball objectives and ultimately win the game. We saw this in the Impulse game, we saw this in the C9 game, and now how do you beat a heavily mid-game team fight? It's not like the other NALCS teams. You don't try to wait it out and wait to late game with a Mundo Rise pick and stuff like that, because the mid-game pressure and damage that Immortals is bringing to the table table with these team comps that they're getting is just insane. Going to be able to put behind all those scaling members that would be good in the late game. You're never going to have that late game chance. So how do you beat it? You not only need to match the mid game pressure of Immortals, but you can't do another skirmish team. You need to do something a bit different and to give yourself an advantage to be able to win this fight. And that's why I'm suggesting for a mid game focus kind of skirmish team, in the sense that they have the ability to skirmish, but all of the champions here have great amount of zone control and can exert a lot of zone pressure on the map. Zac, immense amount of zoning and pressure that he can emit, especially when he's out of vision with the lack of green wards now, and the slingshot range and the bounce up effect, meaning he can engage from such a long distance over long obstacles and walls, meaning he just exerts an enormous amount of pressure, which really either is going to make Immortals hesitant to engage, or they're going to act and be out of position where Zac is going to be able to catch them. Also, Elise, very good, not so much zone control, but the range of the cocoon allows her to catch people out of position, be able to set up a lot of not only ganks to get these members ahead, but also the ability to catch people out and do a decent amount of damage with that as well, especially into the mid lane. If you go with that new Luden's Echo jungle item coupled with, say, like a Rylai's or something, it just does an insane amount of damage. And when I mean catch people out, as I've already stated, Wild Turtle is still displaying the same traits of being out of position and being over aggressive. A simple cocoon slingshot into a gravity well would just completely negate any engage factor that Wild Turtle would try to come. And historically, as we've seen, even if he is displaying these aggressive tendencies, constantly tries to make up for that by making more aggressive plays to try to compensate for the fact that he's behind, meaning that they can really capitalize and snowball on the flaws in the lineup. I think that the mid lane matchup, not only does Victor provide a huge amount of zone control just as Syndra, and I think that's necessary, not only coupled with the wave clear for sieging and counter sieging, but also the ability to fast push lanes when people are dead and be able to effectively zone people away from the turrets with Gravity Well, with Zac pressure, with Pillar of Ice from Trundle being able to zone people away from turrets to take those objectives. But also, I think that both of these champions give Bjergsen the ability to have a huge amount of kill pressure on Pole Belter in the mid lane, because he's most likely going to select another type of control mage if the Lulu is taken off the tables, like Twisted Fate, which we've seen that he can be easily exploited on. Even in that C9 game versus Jensen, he was able to have a lot of kill pressure on Pole Belter, and I think Bjergsen is even have more kill pressure just because of the individual skill matchup there, and I've already kind of stated why that's true. So with the immense amount of damage and zone control coming out from both either a Syndra or a Victor, whatever the personal preference would lead to, I think that would be perfect in outscaling in the outlaning in the mid lane and being able to push that advantage, as well as setting up roams and more skirmishing that they can have for other members, as the mid lane has been pretty much won, or should be won, under these picks. Another thing I want to say is just the nice thing about zone control is it's able to control the skirmishes that Immortals is going to be looking for. And when I mean control the skirmishes, if, say, Hunian, an aggressive top laner, maybe even Lissandra, comes directly into the team, they're going to be able to zone her out, in the sense that you have the Gravity Well that creates a zone of area where you can't stay in it, or you're getting stunned, and you can easily be taken out if you're stunned just with the pure amount of damage in the mid game that this team would be giving you. You have the Zac who can hop on top of himself and be able to kind of CC that. You have the CC and huge amount of zoning CC coming out from a Syndra, even if Victor isn't picked up, which is pretty much the same area of a Gravity Well, just in a single direction. You have the Pillar of Ice not only being able to fragment a skirmish and being able to separate the members of Immortal, but also slowing them, allowing for more damage to be placed on, and also setting up the stuns of a Victor, setting up the stuns of a Zac, setting up the stuns of a Syndra, setting up the cocoons from Elise, setting all that up with the CC and slow that the Pillar brings to the table, as well as just the ability for Lucian to get on a target and deal a massive amount of damage in these mid-game team fights with either the culling, piercing lights, especially with the Stacks of Fervor stacking rapidly with his passive, and his ability to cast a lot of abilities fast with Essence Reaver, so meaning he's just an immense amount of damage dealer, coupled with the zone pressure that all the other members on his team is going to be giving him. So not only do they have the potential with this team comp to exploit the positional errors that Immortals has displayed in the first two games while they've been dominant, but also gives them the mid-game damage and pressure to be able to end the game within 35 minutes really fast, countering the style of that with the zone of control. When I say zones of control, I mean the ability that they're able to control so much of where a skirmish would take place that they're almost guaranteeing themselves to win anything, or being able to disengage or really choose where these skirmishes are going to occur in an area, being able to zone off entrances and exits for Immortals, really trapping them or, allowing them to get picks and such. It works both ways. But another reason I think that this team fight wins, or this team comp wins, is because, say, if both teams play perfect League of Legends, if you play perfect League of Legends with both team comps, both the mid-game skirmish fight and the mid-game control that this team comp brings, you want to know who wins in the late game is the mid-game control comp, because most of the picks that Immortals has displayed as their mid-game skirmish comps really don't scale too well into the late game, especially if that Fiora is already banned away. So if they choose someone like a Lissandra to replace that Fiora, Lissandra does not scale as well into the late game as a Zac, as a Victor, as a Syndra, as a Lucian, and once it scales to the late game, Zac is going to be a huge front line. Elisa at that point is going to evolve into a huge front line. The damage from a Syndra or Victor is going to be insane and scales very well into the late game, especially if it's a Victor. The damage coming out from Lucian can be supplemented with armor penetration if there is any frontline threats, meaning that he still does a decent amount of damage, especially if he gets onto a target with the CC that's all available to this team, as well as just the utility of Trundle. He becomes tankier and tankier and still steals those stats away, allowing for TSM to set up a lot of more kills and take out any pseudo frontline that Immortals would have, because if you look at their past team comps, there's no one who really becomes that main frontline threat transitioning into the late game. Really, Immortals team comps, if they go past 40 minutes, are almost destined to fail, because not only does the damage start to fall off and doesn't scale as well as the options that I've set up for TSM here, but also they don't have a specific front line that remains. They've been operating off pseudo front lines besides the Cho'Gath in that one game, which just happened to be a counter pick. But looking at what they like in the general mindset that they're taking and other picks that they're picking, they do not have an actual fortified stout front line that transitions well into the mid game as well as remaining as strong as they were, transitions well into the late game but remains as strong as they were in the mid game, meaning that this team comp and this zone controlling mid game comp outscales eventually what a skirmish comp would be if it's constructed as a skirmish comp. So that's how I think TSM could win this game, guys. I'm rooting for TSM and Immortals at the same time. I like both teams for different reasons, so hopefully no fanboys are butthurt because of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember, this is a discussion. I'm trying to create discussion within the community. It's my own personal analysis, so feel free to argue with me in the comments. I'll be there ready to respond. As I've already stated in a previous video, if you're really looking to subscribe, I very much suggest it. Rate, comment, and subscribe, as I always say. But I'm going to be producing a lot more videos after this week. I have a lot of personal stuff going on this week, but after this week I'll be putting out videos regularly, champion select analysis, and I really hope to do more videos like this where I can offer personal analysis and predictive analysis, as well as macro and micro game level analysis if I get the technology in place to be able to record those videos. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Peace. It's been 8th Deadly Sin.